Bruno's another one who needs no introduction. You all know about Olshausen and Field. He started at UC Davis and he's been at Berkeley forever now. And he is the director of the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience. So take it away.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be back at CRCNS. I had a CRCNS grant with Charlie Gray many years ago. We'd come to these meetings. And so it's great to be here again and also realize this, program is alive and well, as we heard this morning. Also wanted to just add a shout out to Ken Wang, who I've known since graduate school. He was in Harold Berger's lab at WashU, St. Thomas and David Van Essen's lab, just down the hall. We talked a lot about science in those days. And we both launched our careers at the same time. Me going to UC Davis and kind of advancing through the faculty ranks, and Ken going to NSF and advancing through NSF. And it was really amazing to watch him operate there and launch this program, the CRCNS program, other programs that he was heavily involved in there. And then just the degree to which he was able to build community, reach out to people and get them to authentically buy into this enterprise. Not by sort of claiming, okay, you got to do this, I'm right or whatever, but really kind of listening to them and figuring out how it's all going to work together to build a community. It's a non-trivial thing to accomplish and pull off successfully. So our field definitely needs more people like him. So let's see. I'm going to tell you about some work today that we've been doing on trying to understand the neural computations that support geometric reasoning. But I maybe just want to start off by kind of framing the sort of viewpoint we're coming from, and in terms of also just sort of this emerging field of neuro AI, and what can we expect to learn from AI in neuroscience. And one way of sort of contrasting these is, on the left, we see where AI is headed, and this is just a picture of the supercomputer at UC Berkeley, but kind of representative of many other data centers, which are even much larger. In this case, the NERSC supercomputer consumes 5 megawatts of power and occupies a building the size of a city block. And of course, as you know, many of these data centers now around the world are running neural network models that were very much inspired by neuroscience. But this is sort of, I think, a representative of the path that current AI is on. On the right is what biology built. And it seems to be quite a bit different. So this is the jumping spider. And the jumping spider evolved about 500 million years ago. And this is how vision began. Basically, in this case, a system with 8 eyes. 2 of these forward eyes have very high resolution with lenses that form a high resolution eye at the back of those tubes in the front. Its retina is one-dimensional. And it scans that one-dimensional retina back and forth. You can see that. Unfortunately, the jerky video is jerky because of Zoom. But inside the head there, you can see these tubes kind of moving back and forth. And that's basically how it scans this one-dimensional retina back and forth to build up an image. They can recognize patterns, conspecifics, and so forth, report shift behavior, and navigation, as you'll see in a moment. And all of this is being done in a system with very small form factor, on the order of millimeters, and very low energy consumption with the thing on the left, okay? So I think it's safe to say that science does not understand this. This is really currently beyond science to understand how this works, and also to build it. This is something we're currently incapable of building. It's still a huge mystery to us. And this is, I think, what we all seek to understand at the same time, and the goal. And so, and I think also what kind of this makes clear is on the system on the left, is the disconnect between the algorithm and the physics of computation. The Turing machine, by design, was intended to be divorced from the physics of computation, some abstraction about what you could compute, and how you implement it, whether it be with radio tubes or transistors or whatever, does not matter. That's sort of a fundamental part of the premise of that approach. Whereas many people now in the electrical engineering community are realizing that that's really no longer feasible. In order to think about the design of these algorithms, you have to fundamentally think about the physics of computation, the devices that are implemented. For example, things like memristors or computing light with light, like photonics and so forth, that fundamentally affects what kinds of algorithms you're going to consider and how you might build a system to compute something. And so this is, of course, what biology had to do. Biology had to, and evolution had to figure out how to tweak with the primitives of biophysics. What does biophysics naturally give you with membranes and channels and so forth? And how to sort of tweak with those to figure out how to compute. And so this is, I think, if we're going to understand computation in brains, this is a big part of what we have to understand is the biophysics of computation. And the animals like this make this abundantly clear. And so just maybe a little more about, the behavior in an animal like the jumping spider. This is just showing some of its navigation behavior. So one of the things they noticed in the wild is that when they see a prey item that they want to capture, they capture the prey by jumping at them, as opposed to most spiders that build a web to extend their sensory space. If the prey item is too far away, then they have to sort of plan a route. They have to walk and get within range of it. And they noticed that while it's on the way to being able to capture a prey item, that they make these reorienting turns. They kind of turn their whole body and their head to look at where it is, as though to sort of check, okay, is it still there? And so David Hill, in an experiment, did a controlled experiment of this, where he put the jumping spider in this one-dimensional track, started out this position in the center, puts a prey item somewhere around this ring, where it could see initially. It says, okay, I want to go get that. And then it has to walk down this track to sort of get within range. And this track has walls in it, so it can't just sort of visually monitor where it is, and has little gaps where it can turn. And what they notice is when it turns, then it really turns at the right angle to the correct angle, the new updated angle with respect to the new position of the prey item, the fly in this case. And this is just showing that, the angle that they actually turn at and what they would, what the prediction would be. Okay. So this really kind of, at the time, and I think in many years since, kind of struck people with a lot of disbelief that this could be true. I mean, how could the spider do this? It's sort of like it's forming some internal representation in its head of the position of a prey item with respect to it, and updating that representation over time using some trigonometric calculation. And how could that be true? And so what's astonishing, and this is one of the most amazing developments in neuroscience, I think, is now we can peer inside of the head of animals, like in this case, the fruit fly, and actually see these internal models of the world going on. So the fruit fly has to know, which way is it heading in space. And for many years, people have known about these head direction cells in rats. Models have been developed for them, like Ketchen-Zhang's model, this sort of bump attractor model for these kinds of neural circuits. But no one ever imagined that those would be implemented in a ring of neurons in the rat's brain. But here it is in the fly brain. Deep inside the fly brain there's this toroidal, something called the ellipsoid body that's shaped like a torus. And when you image the activity in this torus, you see this bump of activity that seems to exactly follow the direction heading of the fly. So here's the fly just walking on a styrofoam ball, and they know the ground truth of where it's actually heading, and you can compare that to the peak of this bump that you see in this ring of neurons. This is imaged with calcium imaging, and it seems to be exactly following that. So there it is. This is really kind of amazing to see this, because again, this is a very non-trivial calculation to be able to do, to take all the sensory data that's coming from the compound eye of the fly, from other sources of information about the motor system and how it's moving, and so forth, and to put all this together and build this internal representation of it. There's no one sensor. There's not a sensor for heading direction. It's not using magnetic sensor or anything like that. It's somehow assimilating this and factorizing out all the details of any particular sensor or modality to build this internal representation that's equivariant with the heading of the animal. Okay, so this is really, one of our goals of the field, and then would be to understand how is this possible? How do you take sensory information coming in from something like a compound eye and build this and extract this kind of representation from it? Humans as well are very adept at estimating their own heading and understanding the three-dimensional transformations going on in the environment. So this is just an example of that. If you just take a bunch of random dots that appears kind of structureless on a page in 2 dimensions, but if they're actually attached to a 3D solid, and you just move that solid back and forth, most humans get a very vivid perception, not only of a 3-dimensional axis of rotation, but of an object, a solid cube, a rigid cube. And you can actually sort of hallucinate or see these sort of planes of that cube as it rocks back and forth. So again, this is an example of a factorization, solving a factorization problem. You're taking just all these moving dots. There is no 3D motion here. There is no cube in this data. It's just a bunch of dots on the page. And this is just taking those same dots and randomizing their positions, just to give you a feel for, that's the kind of data that you have to swallow and figure out how to make sense of. Okay, and so what's happening is, we're taking all this data about how these dots are moving around in 2 dimensions and inferring from that a 3-dimensional model of a solid object and as one thing, and its axis of rotation and how it's rotating as another thing. Okay, and so again, we want to know, how is this done by neurons? How do you do these kinds of these computations in a neural system? And again, back to the fly, how do you do it efficiently? What's the sort of nominal solution that you need? How much power do you need to do that? And so forth. These are going to be essential questions, not only in understanding biology, but also in building a practical system. Going back to the spider or the fly, it's important for the system to have small form factor because it needs to be able to move about in the world. So it has to have all of the stuff on board, the power source, the ability to do these computations. It can't just sort of upload stuff or download stuff from some server and things like that, or GPS. It all has to be on the device. And this is the sort of miracle that biology had to solve. Okay, so this is one way of maybe conceptualizing the problem. I sort of keep on referring to this as a factorization problem. And I'm about to show you in a moment, mathematically, it is exactly factorization. You can pose this, in fact, as vector factorization. So just consider a case like this, where we're looking at an object, an image of an object, a cube, it's painted green, and it's some orientation in a scene. And so one way of conceptualizing what's going on here is you have a space of different objects here. A cube might be one of them. You have a space of potential axes of rotation, and you have a space of different colors. And let's say there's 100 of these, 100 shapes, 100 different sort of rotation angles, and axes, and 100 different colors. Then the number of possible images you can generate from that is 1 million. Okay, so there's 1 million different things here. Okay, so we as an observer, your visual system as an observer only gets this. You don't get these things here. This is what's happening in the world, is there certainly causal variables that are combining together to create this. And so your job as an organism is to take this data, which represents a product space. It's the product of these things over here, and factorize it into its underlying causes. And of course, the advantage of doing so is pretty obvious, because instead of having to represent the world in terms of 1 million different things, we can represent the world in terms of 100 things here, 100 things here, and 100 things here. So that's just 300 things total. So that's a much simpler description of what's going on, and arguably a much more useful description, representation of the world, than simply a list of all the possible images that are occurring here. Okay, so again, the question is, how do you do this with neurons? And what we're going to present here is a way to do this with vector factorization. So you can pose as a problem where the image is represented as a large high-dimensional vector, and then basically what we need to do is take that vector and factorize it into vectors representing the shape, another vector representing the axis of rotation, and another vector representing the color. Okay, so just to get us started on this, and okay, so I'm not going to be able to show SO3 and 3-dimensional stuff. This is something we very much want to do, but on the way to that, we can kind of just get started thinking about how you would do this in 2 dimensions. Okay, think about 2-dimensional shapes and 2-dimensional observations of them. And now think about a very simple scenario where you have this pattern, specific object, this letter E, some shape, and it's sitting on a photoreceptor array that is 10 by 10, so 10 by 10 pixels of photoreceptors. So it's a total of 100 measurements of this object. Okay, so that would constitute a point in a 100-dimensional space. We can now think about that E being at a different position on that array, and that would correspond to yet another point in this 100-dimensional space. Okay, now the question is, what about, as the E moves between those 2 positions, then, that middle E there, that's going to correspond to yet another point in a 100-dimensional space. And the question is, well, where is that point in the space? Is it right sort of here, halfway in between these 2 points, 100-dimensional space, or is it off the line? So let you just think about that. And Well, we know it's off the line because if it was right on the line in between the two, that would correspond to an image which was just the average of this image here and this image here. Okay. So this would be the image of something here, right? So we know we can't lie along a line between the two. It has to lie on a nonlinear manifold. Okay. So as the E moves across this array, it's moving up along at the point in this 100-dimensional space, is moving along a nonlinear manifold in this space. Okay, so now then the next thing we can see is that in order to get from this point to any other point in the space, we can do that by multiplying by a matrix. So if I wanted to go from here to here, I would multiply by one matrix. And if I wanted to go from here to way over here, I would multiply by another matrix. And what Sophus Lee realized many years ago, about a century ago, is that all of the matrices, the family of matrices that take you from this point to any other point along the manifold, all belong to a group, what we today call a Lie group. And that whole Lie group of transformations can be parameterized, expressed as a matrix exponential. Okay, so it's just E to a matrix A times a little scalar T here. A T is a parameter that simply says how far along the manifold you are, and A is the generator of this particular manifold of this group of matrices. Okay, so this whole family of matrices is generated by one underlying matrix A, and then T simply says how far you are along this manifold. All right, so that's kind of an interesting realization about the structure of the space and how you might understand it and how you might operate on it. So, and by the way, this arises, this e to the AT arises as the solution to this first order differential equation, x dot equals AX. And another thing to mention is that e to the A is not simply e to each element of A, right? A matrix exponential is a much more, complex operation. And in fact, expressing it this way hides a lot of computational complexity. So you would never really want to compute this thing in reality. And trying to compute derivatives and do backpropagation through it is also kind of unwieldy. So it turns out there's other ways of doing that, which we'll see in a second. Okay, but the next important thing to realize now is that this is the manifold of an E moving across that array. What if we had a different shape, like the letter A moving across that array? Okay, well, that would correspond to a different manifold in space. But the really neat thing is that the transport operator, the Lie group generator that moves us along that manifold, is exactly the same as the operator that moves us along this manifold of the letter E. So any shape that's undergoing this transformation in space, is translating across the array, that transformation can be expressed by the same fundamental operator, the Lie group of matrices here. Okay, so when we think about it that way, we can realize then, given this data, if I'm just given a bunch of data of objects that are undergoing the same kinds of transformations, then what I want to do is take that data and factorize it into which manifold am I on and where am I on that manifold. The thing that tells me which manifold that I'm on is the starting point, let's say x naught, okay? So we want to factorize out, x naught from this product here, and then the thing that tells me where I am on the manifold is that parameter t, or e to the at, the matrix e to the at. Okay, so that's the way we're going to pose the problem here. Just thinking about this simple vision problem of understanding, given all these varieties of the world, I'm trying to factorize it. So this is one way, a way of kind of thinking about that in terms of the concrete problem, the so-called MNIST problem, which is oftentimes posed as simply the problem of recognizing which digit it is. But there's another very interesting thing going on in MNIST, which is there's a set of style transformations going on that nobody ever talks about. It's kind of just treated as random variation, but it's not random variation. Okay, so these images that we get, all these patterns, we can think of as forming a product space. It's the product of two things in this case. It's a product of which object you are along this axis here and what the transformation is. Okay, and so we can think of our job, if we can understand what this matrix A is, for example, for this kind of data, then we can form a much simpler representation, a much more parsimonious representation in terms of a set of objects and a set of transformations acting upon them. Okay, so given this product space, this is what we get to see as data. We want to factorize it into these two things. Okay, so here's a simple example of how you can do this. This is some work done in my lab a few years ago by a really talented undergraduate, Hoyan Shao, who's now at Columbia, Frank Chi, and Yubei Chen, who were grad students in the lab at the time. And so, so the idea here is to just form a very simple linear generative model, bilinear generative model, where we describe the image. Just think of I as a vector of all the pixels in the image, okay? And we're going to describe that image as a product of a transformation and an object, okay? Literally, this matrix times this matrix. And so we're going to parameterize the object in terms of a sparse coding model. So we have a dictionary phi of different possible shapes or features, let's say, and alpha just simply said is a weighting, is the coefficients of those different the columns of phi, which ones we're going to use. And then the matrix T is parameterized by this Lie group, okay, in terms of a matrix exponential and with a parameter S that tells us, how much of that transformation is being applied. Okay, and so now, as I said, we don't really want to have to compute the full matrix exponential. And so one way of simplifying that is by diagonalizing the matrix A. And if we can diagonalize A, so in terms of W sigma W, then it can be expressed this way. So the orthonormal matrices that let you diagonalize it, they come out of the exponential, fortunately, and we're just left with the diagonal elements here. Okay, and those diagonal elements in this case for things like translation and other kind of 2D operations, those matrices, the generated matrices are skew symmetric, meaning their eigenvalues are completely imaginary. And so when you exponentiate a diagonal matrix, it is just, the exponential of each of the elements of the diagonal. Okay, so what you look at here is a diagonal matrix of complex phasors, okay, complex phasors along the diagonal that are all parameterized in terms of a single underlying variable omega. So they have different rate parameters omega, so they're spinning at different rates, but they're all have this common variable S that's changing them. Okay, so the full generative model now, when we express it that way, is that we're saying the image data is a product of a transformation, which is parameterized by this matrix W and a set of objects. So the learning problem then is given a bunch of data, okay, of just observations of some objects in the world undergoing transformations. We don't know what the objects are. We don't know what the transformations are. Learn the W that generate those transformations and the dictionary of shapes that are present in the world. And then for any given image, infer, which object you are. That's the parameter alpha here. And where along the manifold you are for that particular object. That's this parameter S. Okay, so when you do that for a very simple test case of templates, we could just sort of take MNIST templates, 10 digits from the MNIST data set, and let them translate through the image, then it learns here for W, the Fourier transform. So for those of you who know your Fourier transforms, this makes sense because in the Fourier domain, translation is a simple certain amount. And that can be done then by multiplying it by a diagonal matrix of phasors. Whoops, I'm sorry. Let me see. So it learns to do that. So we just give it this data, and here it learns the digits contained in the data that are translating it, and it learns the Fourier transform for translating them to do these transformations. Okay, so this is it looks like a simple solution which we can understand, and by design it was so. But again, you have to remember, we didn't tell it anything about the Fourier transform. We didn't tell it anything about the shapes. All we did is we gave it the computational primitives. We gave it the data of things transforming, and we gave it the computational primitives, namely this bilinear combination, the ability to kind of multiply variables together to be able to learn the structure of the problem. And then it figured it out. The same thing here for rotation and scaling. So we give it digits that are simply undergoing rotation and scaling. So it learns the W matrix appropriate for that, and also the different shapes in that case. And then we can just train it on the full MNIST data set, right? Natural transformations that are the style transformations that are contained in MNIST. And then it learns the set of, a set of shapes. It's not a completely correct solution here of template shapes. And then a matrix W that can generate the transformations, the style transformations in MNIST. In this case, it amounts to like a squeezing operation here and a kind of sort of slanting, changing the tilt of the digit here. Okay, so next step, we want to kind of try to simplify this structure and show that it's equivalent to vector factorization. And you can see that by taking this generative model I just told you about and just doing a little manipulation here, multiplying both sides by W transpose, and then taking just this here and renaming that phi tilde. And remember that this matrix R here of S is a diagonal matrix of phasors. So we can express that as a vector product. This diagonal times that is simply the vector Hadamard product. So that's just the element-wise product representing the object. Okay, then we get our image, our transformed image vector here. So if W is the Fourier transform, then this is the Fourier transform of the image. Okay, so when we do this decomposition, then we can see that the vector, the high-dimensional vector representing the image, is just literally an element-wise product of one vector representing what we'll call the equivariant part. So, where you are along the transformation, the manifold, and another part, which is the invariant part, that's not changing. That's the shape of the object. So our job is really one of vector factorization. And importantly, it looks like, you might be able to solve this by just, looking at I tilde minus the stuff on the right and do quantity squared and do something like gradient descent on that, but that's not going to work because there are many local minima in this landscape. So this is just showing what that energy function looks like as a function of this parameter S here. Okay, so there's many local minima you're going to get trapped in, so that's not going to work. Okay, so what we actually do is we do a minimization over that vector Z, over the vector Z, and just to get a feel for what that is, how it's useful to sort of visualize how it's representing position. This is just kind of showing what's going on. Each of the elements of that vector Z is a complex phasor, and it has a different parameter omega. Okay, and then depending on those omegas, then as you advance the value of X, then each of these phasors is spinning around the unit circle at a different rate. Okay, as you increase the value of X, they're just spinning around the unit circle. And this is just visualizing what that looks like for two phasors. So if you just took the first two phasors there, then basically that forms a two-dimensional torus. So what's happening as you advance the value of X is, for this whole vector, is you're wrapping around, you're just wrapping around an n-dimensional torus. Okay, so that vector Z has some very interesting properties to it. So one is it has a similarity kernel shown here. So this is just the inner product. So dot now is the inner product that collapses this product to a single number. There's similarity. It's looking at there's similarity as a function of the product. So if we just take the element-wise product of this vector representing X and this vector representing Y, then when we product them, it's going to represent X plus Y. So that's going to come in very useful if we want to shift the representation. If we want to take a representation of the E and then shift it over here so we can match it, let's say, with a canonical element-wise operation. Okay, and then so in order to now minimize this with do the inference with respect to Z, then we have to have something that constrains Z to lie to express this manifold of transformations. And so that we do via attractor dynamics. We can write down an energy function that says, well, look, the Z has to be similar to one of these positions, or it could be in between one of these positions. Okay? But it has to sort of lie within the span of this matrix D. So this is basically the energy function we impose on that, and there's simple dynamics. This is really basically a Hopfield network, and it's just a simple generalization of the Hopfield network to complex phasors, which was described by Andre Nost back in 87. Okay, so that's basically what we could do here. But now there's a problem we need to solve, which is that if you want to have a very large amount of space that we want to be able to transform, for example, these are different positions, and if we're trying to express maybe a map of where you are in space, and we want to have a large dynamic range of different positions you are in the world, then we're going to have a very large dictionary of these vectors Z. And the price we're going to have to pay for that is we're going to have to increase the dimensionality of each of these vectors. It doesn't come for free because at some point we're going to have catastrophic interference. And so the dimensionality is going to grow with the size of this dictionary. So again, we're going to appeal to this idea of factorization and say when you're confronted with a very large space of things, see that's interesting. Okay, so okay, let's look at that stuff here. Sorry, I don't know what's going on. Let's see. Maybe I have to reshare the screen. Ah, okay. So it's all right. I think we got it. Yeah. Oh,
These are Zoom whisper.
okay, good. But maybe should I get a time check?
Yeah, you want to leave 5 minutes? For
Yeah,
question?
at least, yeah.
Yeah, in 5 minutes, it'll be 5 minutes.
Okay, okay.
So you got 10 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, so, all right, so yeah, this idea was suggested many years ago by E. Lafitte that this might be representing space using a residue number system. Okay, so this is basically a residue number system is a way of taking a very large range of numbers that you want to represent and breaking it down to a set of numbers with smaller dynamic range. And so this is just an example of that. What you do in a residue number system is you represent a number in a modulo number system. So in terms of its remainder with respect to a certain set of base numbers. So for example, here, if we want to represent the number 41 in a residue number system with base 3, 5, and 7, then this would be the corresponding representation as 216, okay? Because 41 mod 3 is 2, 41 mod 5 is 1, and 41 mod 7 is 6. Okay, so there's a big theory of residue numbers that's been worked out. And so this has exponential coding range, meaning that these particular numbers, for example, as long as they're co-prime, will give you the whole total dynamic range of numbers you can encode is the product of these moduli. Okay, so in this case, it would be 105. So we could represent space over a distance of 105 just by combining, one module that expresses things over a range of 3, another over a range of 5, and another over a range of 7. Okay, another super amazing advantage of residue number systems, which makes you wonder why don't we, build computers this way, is that the operations are element-wise, right? So when you add numbers, you simply add them element-wise, and they just wrap around with this modulo operator, and there's no carry operation, so you don't have to worry about the carry when you do this. And the same thing for multiplication. So the operations are purely element-wise, so it's a lot simpler to do in parallel. Okay, so how are we going to do this with high-dimensional vectors? Well, this is what my amazing student, Chris Kim, figured out, and how to sort of get all this operating in an attractor neural network framework, which I'm going to describe to you in the next couple of minutes. And so the key idea is to represent, what we want to do to represent residue numbers, we want to have a modulo similarity kernel. So if I take the inner product of any two vectors, I want it to now sort of wrap around after you've gone a certain distance. And that's easily accomplished by picking these phases here, the phases here in the base vector, to be discrete, and they have to be sampled simply from the nth roots of unity. So if you want, modulo 7, then you just pick the 7th roots of unity, 7 equally spaced points around here. You can pick them randomly, but it has to be just from discrete probability distribution here. Okay, so that gives you this modulo kind of property. And so now as you advance the value of x, this vector z, you can express as the product of one vector which represents the number mod 7. this vector, which represents the number mod 5, and this number, which represents the number mod 3. Okay, so as you advance this number here, these different representations are simply spinning around their different, modulo space, and you're getting a unique representation for each possible, number here from 0 to 105 around this circle. Eventually, after 105, and then it will repeat over again here over here. Okay, so that's basically the idea. One more problem we have to solve. I'm sorry, just go back here. So what we can do now is, instead of building an attractor neural network for this domain here, we're going to build one attractor neural network here, one here, and one here. Okay, but now we also, here we're doing the product, but we have to do the inverse operation, which is, given a vector z, to compute the factors that went into it. So to factorize the representation of a number in terms of its residue numbers. Okay, so that, it turns out, can be accomplished by this recurrent neural network here, which we call a resonator network. Was developed separately by Pax and Frady in the Redwood Center a number of years ago. We have a couple of papers out on it, but it's a very efficient recurrent neural network that can solve this problem. And the way to sort of think about this is really just 3 Hopfield networks that are coupled together with each other through this multiplicative operation. So you express the fact that there's this, this vector z as a product that you're feeding in it, this vector z that you're feeding in as input, as a product of 3 different vectors, and that's a constraint in the system. And so basically you can develop this attractor neural network, which is just formed of 3 Hopfield networks that are interacting via this multiplicative operation. Okay, so that can very efficiently then take the representation of a number and factorize it in terms of its moduli. Okay, and so this has really attractive properties. So, that it all pays off. We can get a very large scaling of a dynamic range with much less dimensionality. So it scales well with dynamic range. That's what we wanted to get. It's robust to noise. So these phasors, this is something that Chris has shown beautifully. It's robust to noise, meaning we can add lots of phasor noise to the input, to the dictionary of patterns, to the dynamics. We can add phasor noise at various points in the system and bang on it, and it's stable. It still works, and it's robust, and in part due to this high dimensionality that's being conferred here. Okay, so that means, sort of hint here is that it's something we can kind of scale down and build at low form factor and work with very low amounts of power, where you're this sort of noisy regime with devices and biophysics and so forth. And the last problem we have to solve is how to do this in 2 dimensions. And so that can be done by representing space in the so-called Mercedes-Benz frame. So here is a case of just 3 in a non-negative space spanned by these vectors. And we just need one more constraint, which is that these phases add to 0. And that's to express the fact that if you add all 3 of these vectors to here together, they sum to 0. Okay, so and then that allows you to uniquely encode any point in this 2-dimensional space. And this is just showing how that pans out. This is like a Voronoi diagram showing you unique encodings at different points in 2D space. Eventually it does wrap around for what this is for modulo mod 5 in 2D space. And also, this is the important part, that a triangular frame gives you a much more efficient representation of space, more efficient tiling of space than simply north, south, east, west, which would also be a non-negative way of encoding space, but is much less efficient. And that's what's being shown here, is that this spacing with the triangular reference frame is I'm sorry, this is the entropy up here, the total range for the blue dots, or what you get. So there's a big payoff in that. And this is, I think one way to reason, this is why we have these hexagonal, well, I'd like to think it's the reason why we have this hexagonal grids in the grid cell system, is because of this reason. And as far as I know, this has not been shown by any other model of the grid cell system. And then finally, just coming back to biology, this is in fact, what people are seeing here. So if you go back to the model, what it predicts is that you would have this representation of space that wraps around in 2D. It basically, you're using a bunch of, n-dimensional tori to represent a 2-dimensional torus of space for one of those modulo residue numbers at 5. And so it basically wrap around in space. And this is exactly, of course, what many of you know. One sees in the data, this is from Daniel Gardner and the Moser group, just looking at the state space of 150 neurons in entorhinal cortex in one of those modules. And then, it's just it's space here as a torus, as a 2D torus. And so this gives us a way of understanding that structure and why it would be advantageous for biology to do that, and why it would be advantageous to build neural systems that way. Okay, so I'll just leave you with these points. What we're trying to aim for is systems we can build at low power and small form factors, so they can be autonomous and work in the world. that to solve this for vision and other sensory problems, this problem of vector factorization or factorization of some kind is going to prove to be monumentally important. And we made a lot of progress, I think, solving that. And that this residue number system is another way of expressing this factorization idea and could serve as a model of the grid cell system. All right, so I'm happy to take questions. And
We've got 7 for talking.
oh, okay. Okay. All right.
Yeah,
So
so there's 7 minutes left for questions, so.
You started with examples from vision to talk about invariance and equivariance of translation, but then you showed examples from coding from hippocampus. Do you predict grid cells in vision?
Well, thanks for pointing out the link there, right? So maybe just to kind of make that clear, is that, the sort of arc I was trying to draw here is, is working from the visual system, thinking about this problem of equivariance, invariance in vision. That leads to this factorization problem, factorizing in terms of shapes and equivariances, which are very naturally expressed as high-dimensional vectors. And now we can just focus on the equivariant part and say, let's say I'm an animal wandering around the world and I want to represent where I am in the world. That's just the equivariant part, or my heading would be like that. And so now we're sort of building that out. That model there is just for the equivariant part. So sort of two flip sides to that question. One is, so could we think of this kind of residue number thing going on in the visual system? Why not? It seems very sensible, right? I think that's one of the things that has gotten me excited. Because when I think about these sort of implementing these Z groups in the visual cortex and so forth, one starts to think about, well, how much range can we shift over? How am I going to implement these things? We haven't worked it out yet, but it seems like a promising trajectory to me. I certainly wouldn't rule it out. And the flip side of that is, representing the equivariant part of here, where the animal is in space or it's headed, but the complementary part of the other is the invariant part. The SLAM problem would be, where am I and what's the shift? Where are the bounds of my world? And that's what's invariant, right? As you move around the world,
You stay away.
so thinking about how you
He's taking him away from me. What are you talking about? Where's that bonding strip?
They're fascinating, very inspiring.
And another thing, stop with this spaceman thing. It's getting on my nerves. Are you saying you want to lodge a complaint with Star Command? Oh, okay.
I hope you don't have to do that. I think that's just something to see. I'm going to turn that question back on you. Why do you want to scale up to deep neural network?
I was thinking that if you want to, you have two equations, one encodes the position, the other encodes the objects.
Yeah.
You envision that this, the function that encodes position is a neural net, the function that encodes object is another function. And it is another neural net, and somehow the factorization in the more high-level latent space.
Yeah. I think the key thing I would say here is those neural nets that we're using for each of those parts are very simple. And all the cases I've shown here, it's like a one matrix, right? And so I would rephrase your question as how are you going to scale this up to work on, here is MNIST. What if I want to do the whole world, images in the world? But again, I think you have to remember for a biological system like us, we work with foveated retinas. So it's very different, foveated visual systems, right? So you don't have high resolution everywhere like an ImageNet image, right? At any given time, you're only getting high resolution where you look. So framing the problem is going to be different, but still you have to sort of think about how do you scale it up to a whole scene. I think we can get there. I think we can get there without deep learning. Not that, one should have to avoid that. But the point here, where we're going with this whole philosophy approach is to figure out what's the nominal solution. What's the just sufficient kind of set of components and computations you need to solve this? Because that's what biology had to do to build the jumping spot. It had to solve that problem with just, you can't have any extra gunk in there. It's just enough to solve it. And that's what we're after, that sort of nominal solution. So if we did start with a deep net, then I would sort of want to think about how to shrink it down to extract the solution from it. Yeah.
And then start with you. Yeah.
So two interrelated questions, Bruno. One is, what happens when you have nonlinearities in the system, where the simple idea of factorization as it is may not work? And the other is, at least in physics, there are examples of strongly correlated situations where you have everything interacting with everything,
Yes.
and where you have to sort of, the problem doesn't factorize, and you need other methods like, perturbative RG and so on.
Yes.
Are you saying biology doesn't care about those regimes?
That, thanks for asking that. I definitely would say that, right? Okay.
What's the question?
Okay, so I'll rephrase the question. So, Karthik is asking about, what about non-idealities in the system and so forth? And, are we saying that we can just sort of ignore those or what? And I'm definitely not saying that. And we're starting off with this ideal setting and posing it as a factorization problem. It doesn't necessarily require linearity, right? Because the factor is a product, right? So, but still, we're assuming perfect multiplication, that I can take two phasors and I can multiply them, or I can add their phases. How are we going to do that with imperfect circuitry? So that has to be ultimately addressed. But, the order of things here is to sort of think about a mathematical solution. Okay, and then now how do I implement it? And what's very encouraging though is like work by Chris Summer, my colleague at the Redwood Center in Paxton Brady. We had this paper open called Threshold Phasor Associated Memory, showing how you can implement these phasor attractor neural networks, like Andre Noce described, using spike timing in a neural system. So just the timing of a spike relative to the phase of an ongoing oscillation is a potential way of doing that, representing phase. And now, even though conceptually, mathematically, it's the multiplication of two phasors, what you have to do is now figure out how to shift the timing of the spike when you combine them, right? So it's kind of, and then certainly you can get that to work in a spiking a neural system. So that's, I think, one encouraging step along that path. Other work by Connor Beide has explored how you would do this multiplication with phasors and hardware. The kind of, and simply how ideal that would be for you to do. But it's all TBD, I would say, right? But obviously, I would say, based on everything said, again, the non-idealities of biology are hugely important. Those are front and center. That's what we need to grapple with, right? And to build systems that can work robustly in that setting. That's what evolution had to figure out for the jumping spider. Yeah.